Good evening, everybody. It's Dr. Patmos, and it is April the 14th. And I have a very important video for you tonight. And, I'm an internist. I also have training in infection control. And, internists, we're trained to always think about the worst things first. I mean, it's a little bit of a morose specialty. I'm the first one to admit it. But there are times when it is important for a physician or a clinician to approach things from the standpoint of what's the worst possibility this could be. Well, that's kind of going to be the theme of this presentation this evening. And it all has to do with rabies. Now, for those of you who don't know that, the CDC just the other day announced that it is suspending, we don't know for how long, but it is suspending all testing for rabies. Now, most people say, well, it's not that big a deal because not testing is very selective. It's not done across the board. It is a case by case type of thing, and the actual incidence of rabies is extraordinarily rare. Only about 3 to 5 people in the United States die every year from rabies. So it's really, we're talking about a very, very rare disease, right? But it wasn't always this way. This is why it is so important for anybody who puts their toe into the waters of healthcare that they have to understand the history of healthcare, especially the history of infectious diseases, because most diseases are infectious diseases. So, what is the story about rabies? It's actually a fascinating story. Rabies, by the way, for those who don't know, it is probably one of the worst diseases there is. It is a horrific, horrible disease and one of the worst deaths that anybody could possibly have. Rabies, once you get it, once you start getting sick from it, is 100% universally fatal. There is no effective treatment for rabies. All a doctor can do is watch you die. And, rabies was common in the United States 100 years ago. There were 1,000 or more deaths every year from rabies. Colonial America, rabies was very well known and very common. And people got it and by the thousands and died by the thousands every year. And why were people getting rabies 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Because they got it from dogs. It was really dogs, domestic dogs and wild dogs and loose dogs and un unmanaged dogs, just kind of dogs that were loose, stray dogs. Were a big problem, and they were carrying rabies, and they would bite a person, and then weeks or months later, that person would get sick and die of rabies. The incubation period in an animal bite is very, very long. So, rabies was a big problem back in the day until a name that should be familiar to you, Louis Pasteur, invented a post exposure rabies vaccine, which he began administering. And lo and behold, it prevented people who were bitten by rabid dogs from developing rabies. We had our first um, post exposure vaccination against rabies. There's also a time where rabies vaccination was developed for dogs and cats and domestic pets, and laws were passed all around the country that mandated mandated vaccination for all pets. And that is the law in everywhere that I know. If you have a dog or a cat, you have to have that animal rabies vaccinated. It's mandatory. And that's important because if you get bitten by a rabid dog or cat, you're going and you get rabies, you will die. There is no treatment for it. Well, as a result of mandatory vaccination of rabies of all domestic pets, rabies basically declined and it went to almost nothing. And it shifted. It shifted from being in the canine world to being in the wild animal world, where rabies is still very common among bats, are the most likely source now, raccoons, and wolves and foxes can carry rabies. And so Humans might still encounter rabies from contact with one of those wild animals. Bats are, it's the most common thing right now for people to get rabies in the United States is from bats. And it can just be an incidental exposure. The people sometimes don't even know that they had a bat bite. Um, so, and then the other risk, of course, is that one of these animals, a fox or a bat, could bite your pet. And if your pet's not vaccinated, then your pet gets rabies, and then you can get rabies from your pet. So, the bottom line in all this was that rabies was a very common problem in the United States 100, 200 years ago, and it became rare because of vaccination, and mainly because of mandatory vaccination of dogs and cats. Well, what's happening now? Well, the CDC is completely gutted. RFK under Trump, Robert F. Kennedy has essentially destroyed the CDC. The staffing has been reduced dramatically. The funding has been reduced dramatically. They're a demoralized organization, beaten down, and they don't even have the staff now. So they're suspending rabies testing uh, for the time being. Now, probably they'll resume it at some point, hopefully, but for the time being, there's no rabies testing. Now, is this a big deal? Well, no, rabies testing is not done across the board. It is a very limited sort of thing. It's tested for in specific situations. But some of those specific situations are very important. And let me give you an example of one. There's a thing called transplant rabies. Now, and there have been multiple cases where this has occurred. One occurred not too long ago in Idaho. And here's the issue: a person may be exposed to a bat or a raccoon or a skunk or something, get bitten, and not think anything of it, and then weeks or months later start to get sick and develop what appears to be like an encephalitis. That's what rabies is. It's a viral brain infection, and it gives you an encephalitis. Your brain just rots, and the manifestations are absolutely horrible. But so this patient in Idaho got bitten by a skunk or a raccoon or something. Didn't think anything of it. Never got looked in. Never got medical attention about it. And then months later, declined due to a non-specific encephalitis, which was rabies, but except it wasn't recognized as rabies, and because it's not an easy diagnosis to make. Most physicians have never seen a case, but once you've seen a case, you won't forget it. I promise you that. Anyhow, patient died and then was an organ donor and gave corneas and kidneys and other organs. Well, sure enough, every recipient of this patient's organs within a few weeks to a few months got rabies and died. Well, a couple of the cornea transplant patients were notified as soon as they figured out that the donor had rabies, and they had their transplanted corneas removed. Bad news for them, because you remove the cornea, they don't have another cornea to put in there. They are effectively blinded immediately. Overnight, they become blind. But that's a secondary issue. The primary issue is the fact that transplant patients who are organ donors, if they die of a non-specific encephalitis, the wise clinician would consider the possibility of rabies and have them tested before their organs are donated to some poor recipient who happens to get a rabies infected donor organ. Well, we can't test for rabies anymore in that situation because the CDC has suspended it. So, it is a rare thing, but right now we are vulnerable in the United States where patients who are organ donors are not going to be tested. They're not routinely tested anyway. It's only if there's certain circumstances that warrant it. But even under those circumstances now, there's no testing. There's nobody else who does rabies testing other than CDC. And so we are now turning back the clock to where we were, in the past, where we didn't have any way to test, and so people, we're going to see some rabies in the United States. Now, will it ever return to where it was? That would require a reduction in the rate of vaccination of our pets. And oh, by the way, what about rabies in other countries like in India and in sub-Saharan Africa? It's still a big problem. They don't have the aggressive mandatory vaccination rules that we have in the United States. And so, I think something like 10,000 people die every year in those parts of the world from rabies. So, rabies is still a real thing in many parts of the world. It's just very rare in the United States. But it could come back. And here's one reason why it might increase in the United States because of the anti vax movement. Now, most anti vax groups have been a little bit gun shy about coming out and directly attacking rabies vaccines, but they plant the seed of doubt about vaccination in the public. And as a result, something like 30 to 40% of pet owners now think that rabies vaccination is probably unnecessary and shouldn't be done. And there's now an effort for mandatory informed consent, as if we didn't do informed consent before. There's actually an effort to try to stop vaccinating pets for rabies. And some well known anti vaxxers have argued that and planted seeds of doubt. Sherry Tenpenny, in particular, has raised the issue about fear of rabies vaccination, that the vaccine could be a bigger problem than the disease. I mean, my God, if you have never seen rabies, you don't know. There is a video, and I actually posted it on my LinkedIn profile a couple of days ago. If you have the nerve to watch it, there is a video from the 1950s in Iran that followed a patient for 5 days as he died of rabies. There's no audio to this. It's a grainy black and white old film from 75 years ago, but it shows very graphically what it is like to die of rabies. It is a horrific, horrible disease. So it's fascinating that this is the situation we have in the United States right now. Let me tell you something. We need to get rabies testing up and going, up and running again at CDC, just like we did before. We need to make sure that everybody understands that it is mandatory to vaccinate your dogs and your cats. The failure to do so is unacceptable and irresponsible. Uh, and people have to realize that there is no prophylactic rabies vaccine. So we are all vulnerable. Any one of us could get rabies. If you encountered a raccoon, a bat, or a skunk, or a rabid dog or cat, or a fox, and you get bit, you could get rabies. So we're all vulnerable. The only thing you can do if you're exposed, you have a significant exposure, is to take post-exposure prophylaxis, which is prevents the disease. If you fail to do that and symptoms begin, you are going to die. It's 100% fatal, horrible disease. So anyhow, I the anti-vaxxers have done so much damage to this country by instilling this fear of vaccination, this unreasonable, delusional fear of vaccination. And, a lot of it's been around, COVID and influenza and measles and so forth. But pretty soon that fear of vaccination is going to spread into diseases like rabies. It already has. There is rabies vaccine skepticism out there. And that is probably one of the most terrifying things that I can think of, is the notion that people would begin to think that rabies vaccination is not necessary for dogs and cats and take rabies. That's one disease, man. You don't want to take rabies lightly. Check out the video if you have the courage to watch it.